Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first Seekers session of 2020, A Vision for Your Life, the Practice of Intention. It's great to be back with you. At the beginning of the year, I wanted to talk about the connection between intentionality and vision, and then how vision leads to manifestation in our lives. Now, the word intention has two roots. First, the Latin meaning, to direct your attention to, and then the Middle English meaning, which is to extend. At the start of the new year, a lot of us aspire to doing both of these things, turning our attention to the transitional moment, in this case, the transition from one decade to the next, which in turn, of course, reminds us of the passage of time. And second, we become aware of extending ourselves into the unknown, which we're doing at every moment, of course, but only tend to notice at momentous junctures like this. Now, the habit of not noticing what's passing in our lives uh, is close to the original meaning of sin. It's the ignorance, the missing of the mark from which all suffering stems. When we go unconscious in the present moment and don't pay attention, we cease to live in a meaningful way. We find ourselves going through the motions, but inwardly absent. It's like a fog of forgetfulness engulfs the mind. We may find ourselves drifting through our days, carried along by a train of habits and routines and fears and addictions, which in turn numb us to life as it is and what may be waiting for us in the future. Fortunately, we can't do this forever. Sooner or later, we're forced to wake up and look around carefully at where we're going. And that's, of course, why we make New Year's resolutions. The word resolution comes from the Latin verb to release. In times of transition like this, we make resolutions to let go of the old and make way for the new. We take stock of the habits that we use to numb ourselves, and we promise ourselves that we will do better. For a moment, we feel the mandate to change, to improve ourselves and others, and not undervalue another precious year feeling stuck behind obstacles that it's within our power to remove. Then the fog of inattention rolls in, generally, and by Valentine's Day, we're more or less back to where we started from. Now, that can sound pessimistic, but those are the facts. The question that interests us today is, why do so many of us fail at manifesting the things that we long for in our lives, despite our best intentions? Why do we resist changes that we know would be for the best? Is it a lack of enthusiasm, that after the excitement of the moment passes, we lose steam and just fall back to where we were? Is it a problem of sincerity, that we want to desire the things that we resolve to do, but don't really or not completely? Is it an issue of discipline, that we simply lack the tenacity to stick to our choices? Or is our failure to stick to our best intentions primarily a problem of unconsciousness, meaning our resistance to making positive changes stems mostly from an inability to pay attention in the sense of seeing things as they are? Now, a lot of the time, it's all of the above. And I speak from experience. For longer than can like to remember, I used to resolve every New Year's Eve that I was going to quit smoking, for example. On December 31st, I would promise myself that this was the year that I'd throw these noxious things in the trash for the last time. But every single year I failed. The frisson, the excitement of New Year's Eve would pass. I realized that while I told myself that I wanted to stop, the truth is that cigarettes continued to fill a kind of shadowy need inside me that I wasn't ready to let go of. In terms of discipline, I was powerless not to pick up a pack of cigarettes when the urge to smoke took over. And overarching all of these factors was the problem of unconsciousness, an inability to sustain my attention or stay focused on the larger, deeper truths of my life. Those truths included the fact that Number one, smoking was the only thing that I did on a regular basis that I was ashamed of. Number two, that smoking often made me feel physically ill. Number three, that my mother had died of lung cancer. And finally, that the rest of my life was dedicated to telling the truth and waking up. Whereas this is one area where I was unable to stay focused on telling the truth and awakening. I was too addicted to do that. The trouble was, I had no sustainable vision to carry me through my doubts and temptations. Vision meaning the ability to stay focused on what really matters. Maintaining a vision of wellness, wholeness, healing is indispensable to spiritual awakening. Spiritual vision has nothing to do with perfectionism. It doesn't require us to wage an endless war on ourselves to be better than we are, or torture ourselves into some imaginary idea of what an enlightened person looks like. Instead, vision allows us to remain connected to our spiritual instinct, to remove obstacles from our path that prevent us from moving naturally toward beauty and truth and love. When I was finally able to quit smoking, it wasn't because I'd punished myself into submission or strong-armed my way to abstinence. It was because I was finally happy in my life after many years of turmoil. I'd created a home, I'd found a stable relationship, I devoted myself full-time to writing, and I'd understood that spirituality was my passion. So I had removed many of the obstacles to self-love that had tripped me up since I was a child. And I was finally peaceful enough to imagine a genuinely happy future. This vision of happiness grew stronger until one day, and it wasn't on New Year's Eve, I finally gave up smoking for good. Quitting wasn't the same kind of struggle because my vision had truly changed. I knew it was really over. I knew that even if I were to smoke, it would still be over because I was not the same person. I wasn't looking at the world through the eyes of a wounded child who needed to comfort myself by sucking on a kind of shadowy thumb through cigarettes, which were a symbol of my own addicted mother. That child wasn't running my life anymore. And after 3 weeks or so, I'd finally stopped thinking about smoking altogether, and I haven't picked up a cigarette since. Now, this shift taught me a very important lesson, which is that vision leads to manifestation. I've witnessed this principle in action in so many people's lives in a wide variety of situations. For example, I know a woman, let's call her May, who has struggled with obesity for most of her life. The strong-willed daughter of an abusive father, she learned very young to protect herself with fat and using food as a pacifier. Nothing May did to lose weight had managed to help her. Even though she was highly successful in other areas of her life, as a devoted mother, as a very successful businesswoman, self-care seemed beyond her reach, and she wasn't quite sure why this was. When I first met May in a class that I was teaching, she was extremely withdrawn, as if she were encased in a kind of gladiatorial armor. When she spoke, which was rarely, her remarks were clever, funny, and often sardonic, but never self-revealing. This was someone who had gotten where she was through courage, but it was a rigid, tough-breasted kind of courage that prevented deep connection and self-exposure. Being vulnerable for May was simply not an option. Now, as she continued to use writing for self-inquiry over the following year, I could see and feel her protective armor starting to drop piece by piece. Slowly, May began to speak from her heart, to reveal painful truths from the past, admit her fears, grieve her losses, and allow herself to weep instead of hiding behind the mask of the strong woman. In the midst of this healing, May had a serious health crisis that actually helped her to focus her budding vision. She realized it was time to take her life back. It was now or never. The better May began to feel about herself, the more her emotional load lightened. which allowed her to believe, perhaps for the first time, that she could be truly happy. This vision guided May to the right doctors and significant lifestyle changes that she adopted with unprecedented ease. And now, 18 months later, May's lost 150 pounds and experienced a physical, emotional, and spiritual renaissance that's truly remarkable to behold. Recently, she sent me a positively chirpy note and said she'd just taken a 7-mile hike with her daughters, which would have been unimaginable a year ago. May is no longer struggling with food either. Her vow of self-care has filled the void that kept her craving before. And it's also freed up energy for enthusiasm toward other areas of her life. That's why self-inquiry is critical to uncovering our true intention. Because until we attend to our larger, deeper truths, vision and manifestation have a very hard time coming into focus. In May's case, without finding freedom from emotional imprisonment, her need to punish herself with food would likely have never shifted. Intention saves us from feeling adrift and uncentered and setting goals that never come to pass for reasons that we can't quite fathom. Now, let's turn our attention to vision and manifestation as they play out specifically in spiritual life. I'd like to look at 3 seminal questions that affect the lives of most seekers. First, what are the obstacles to self-love and self-care in your spiritual practice? Next, what do you need to pay more attention to in your life specifically? And finally, what are your intentions as a seeker, if you have any? And do you have a vision of what awakening would look like in your life? Let's start with the obstacles to self-love and self-care. Spiritual practices of all kinds, across the board, aim at reminding us of our connection to that awakened part of ourselves that's beyond personality. You can call it the divine. You can call it simply the self-conscious one. Until you develop an appropriate self-love for the unique human being that you are, and vow to care for that being with heartfelt devotion, you can't experience your own true nature. The obstacles in your mind, the shadows that keep you from seeing clearly, will prevent spiritual awareness from emerging. It will not let itself be known to us. In spiritual life, we can only truly know what we love. It's only when we open to mystery and surrender our resistance that the light of God can shine through us. When we drop our defenses, when we stand naked in the world, figuratively speaking, and abide with our own imperfections, the inner eye begins to open. And that's when life becomes much simpler and less conflicted. As self-care becomes second nature, we learn that it's not enough to take care of the body or educate the mind while ignoring the spiritual dimension. Nor is it possible to awaken while devoting ourselves only to the divine while overlooking the needs of the body. Removing the obstacles to self-care in your spiritual practice means taking up the slack in precisely those areas that you most avoid. Most of you are familiar with seekers who enter the path imagining that they're going to be able to leapfrog the body and the mind, the messiness of being human, and jump straight into the absolute. This delusion is not our friend. This delusion actually undermines spiritual self-care because it sets us up for a fall. Awakening doesn't relieve us of being human. It creates more space within us to accommodate all of it. In turn, this reminds us of that part of ourselves that is already awake. But in order for this to happen, we do need to remember to pay attention. The next question is, what specifically do you need to pay attention to in your life? It's a full-time job, as we all know, to pay attention not only to ourselves, but also to the world around us. In fact, because there's so much input, we adapt by allowing our attention to dwindle in the areas that interest us the least or cause us the most difficulty or are simply not as important to us, until we find that we've become half conscious in our lives. We tend to practice a kind of attention triage, as if our supplies were running out and we don't have an extra bit of it to spare. But attention is the gateway to awakening, and the more absent it is, the less vital our lives become. Without attention, we miss the present moment, and with it, our chance to be fully alive. On the other hand, when we manage to sustain our attention, the world is transformed into miracle. When we notice the details, we feel genuinely enchanted, very often by the most ordinary things. There's a great account of a cancer survivor that I found quite striking. This is what he wrote, quote, "I had never in my life seen an icicle formed from beginning to end. But the hours of doing nothing, which cancer provided, allowed me to look outside my window in awe of slowly dripping water that turned into a long, sharp, invincible-looking icicle that slowly melted away right before my eyes in the morning sun and mysteriously returned again in the late evening." Quote. Isn't that beautiful? Now, if attention to icicles can lead to an epiphany like that, imagine the power of turning your attention to the parts of your inner landscape that block out the light. Now, what if you focused that attention on the things in your life that obscure self-knowledge and then held steady until you were able to see through them to what lay underneath? Let me give you an example. Let's say that you're somebody who has forgotten how to play in your life. I hear this so often from responsible, accomplished people, that in the effort to become a serious seeker or a respectable grown-up, they've ignored the childlike side of their nature, believing it to be the least important aspect of life. And then in middle age, or sometimes sooner, they become aware that there's a hole in their lives where joy should be. They realize they've stopped paying attention to playing. When they begin to look closer at this oversight, they feel compelled to discover its roots, the backstory to this inability to simply enjoy oneself. They ask questions like, what am I avoiding by avoiding play? And the answers that arise often surprise us. You might uncover the hidden belief that if you stop being so serious, your life would fall apart, or you'd lose your ambition, or you'd become hedonistic, or selfish, or, God forbid, waste time. That insight could lead you to look at your fear of failure, the ways that you overcompensate, the disappointments you've experienced in the past when you abandoned yourself to pleasure. Whatever the cause of your resistance, you realize that until you pay attention to your need for play, you will continue to drink too much, or pick on your kids, or spend too much time complaining, hating your job, or feeling a general malaise that you can't quite figure out. This realization allows you to begin to heal your discarded, mistreated, or ignored parts and seek out the positive ways to release the energies that they contain. And finally, we come to the last question. What are your intentions as a seeker? And do you have a vision of what awakening would look like in your own life? This question is much more important than a lot of us realize. Without paying attention to the promises of spiritual life, it's next to impossible to weather the setbacks and distractions that are bound to arise as we move toward awakening. Unless you have some sense of your destination, not a fixed destination, but the zone toward which spiritual life will lead you, why would you care enough to continue? Spiritual awakening is not only the most important task you can undertake, it is also hands down the most difficult. Nothing challenges the ego more intensely than practices aimed at revealing its limitations and questioning its authority. With each step on the spiritual path, you'll be met with doubt and resistance. Your efforts to switch your orientation from self-centered materialism to one of openness, mystery, surrender will be arduous and sometimes dispiriting. So without being grounded by clear intention, it will be hard to maintain a vision of freedom and what an enlightened life might look like. Deprived of such a vision, the desire to manifest spiritual change will be compromised, if not completely defeated. And that's why seekers need role models for inspiration as living proof that practice works. I know that as a skeptic, I would never have believed that enlightenment was possible or spiritual progress without seeing spiritual masters with my own eyes and witnessing how these folks, how different they were from so-called ordinary people who were unfamiliar with their own divine nature. Without this belief, I can't imagine where the impetus to keep practicing and focusing on awakening would have come from for the past 30 plus years. It's fashionable to imagine that spiritual life should be void of goals and desires, as if wanting to wake up was an obstacle in itself, a proof of spiritual materialism. But that is nonsense. As we've talked about before in the forum, without the desire to meditate or do yoga or pray or read inspirational books or join communities like this one, nobody would be drawn to the spiritual path. Without longing, there would be no effort. And without effort, there would be no results. A vision of awakening is necessary for manifesting a new way of life. So long as we don't imagine that we're in control or become fixated on particular outcomes, spiritual longing is actually our greatest ally, because it eventually leads us to the realization that we already contain within ourselves the divinity, the enlightenment that we're seeking. So ask yourself in the beginning of this new year, what larger, deeper truths of your life do you need to pay attention to? How do armoring, avoidance, magical thinking prevent you from attending to what is true? When it comes to self-numbing, what habits do you reach for to soften the truth or take the edge off or relieve the pressure of needing to change? Do you have a vision for happiness? And how do your present intentions line up with that vision? What are the obstacles to self-love in your life? And what do you long to manifest that seems to be beyond your grasp? These are very important questions to contemplate as we continue to expand and awaken and thrive. And now, before we open up the line to questions, I'd like to do a brief reflection together. You may want to write down your thoughts and feelings, or if not, you can simply think about this question. I'd like you now, please, to take 3 minutes to reflect on the obstacles to self-love and self-care in your own spiritual practice. What are the obstacles to self-love and self-care in your practice? Let's take 3 minutes now to do this reflection, and then we'll come back together as a group.